I was left at the age of 14 at my grandmother's house by my parents, who had deemed me a freak due to my medical issues. Now, they are seeking financial assistance from me to help my brother extricate himself from a challenging situation. To provide context, I was diagnosed with epilepsy at a young age. This was unfortunate, as my parents were not equipped to cope with the situation emotionally or mentally. I was not adequately equipped to deal with the emotional and mental challenges that arose as a result of my parents' inability to cope with my condition. I believe that I was approximately 6 years of age when I first observed the stark contrast in the way my parents treated my brother and me. My brother was 3 years my senior. My parents treated my brother and me quite differently. They were more lenient with him, presumably because he was easier to manage than I was. Additionally, my diagnosis with dyslexia and severe ADHD at the age of 8 further complicated matters. It is evident that my parents were already struggling to cope with my condition. Given the circumstances, it would be reasonable to expect a certain level of emotional and practical support from my parents. However, they were not equipped to handle the challenges of parenting a child with special needs. They had not anticipated the difficulties that would arise from having a child with additional needs. This was an inevitable consequence of their assumption that, given my brother's apparently healthy development, I would also be perfectly well. They were unprepared for this outcome and, now that I was already born, had no choice but to deal with me. They ensured that I felt accepted and loved, but this was not the case. My parents demonstrated a lack of tolerance towards me, which had a detrimental impact on my childhood. My experiences were not merely the result of my illnesses, they were also shaped by the way my parents treated me. While my illnesses played a minor role, the way my parents responded to them significantly contributed to my distress. They responded to it and treated me in a way that caused me significant distress. They consistently treated me as an outsider within my own family, never making me feel included. They made it clear that I was an unwelcome burden on the family. They would tread carefully around me, and it seemed as if every time I entered a room, upon my arrival, they would abruptly cease all conversation, as if my mere presence had drained the life from the room. This was a common occurrence when I was still under the age of 10. As I grew older and my mental health deteriorated, I found myself increasingly unable to tolerate this treatment. Consequently, I began to misbehave in an effort to cope with the overwhelming stress and anguish I was experiencing. During my teenage years, the combination of adolescent hormones and the distress of growing up in a home where I felt unwelcome led to a deterioration in my emotional state. This resulted in a lack of motivation to study, which manifested as poor academic performance. I was enraged by my parents' treatment of me. I exhibited defiance, disobedience, and discourtesy toward everyone I knew. I alienated even my friends. I was aware that my actions were inappropriate, but I was so distressed that I was unable to discern an alternative means of garnering my parents' attention. Despite the gravity of the situation, my parents did not appear to be particularly concerned. Upon being summoned by the school for disciplinary reasons, they would merely express their disappointment and refrain from reprimanding me. This lack of consequence only served to exacerbate my frustration, leading me to resort to emotional outbursts. I attempted to garner their attention by engaging in disruptive behavior within the house, but they would simply ignore me and continue their conversation in a manner that was deliberately loud and inconsiderate of my presence. They would make remarks such as, "I'm sure you're having another one of your tantrums," and would roll their eyes in disapproval. I was unable to elicit any further responses from them. This was a particularly disheartening experience for me. However, at the age of 14, I committed a serious infraction at school. I made the decision to act out and brought a pack of cigarettes to school, smoking one in the middle of class. My teacher demanded that I cease my disruptive behavior and leave the classroom. I responded by making a rude gesture, which proved to be the final straw. Prior to this incident, I had already exhibited a proclivity for mischief at school. However, I had managed to avoid disciplinary action due to my parents' assertion that I was not a typical child. My parents were forced to excuse my behavior due to my mental instability. However, after that incident, there was no going back. I was expelled, and my parents were visibly enraged. They reprimanded me severely and said a number of things that I will never be able to forget or forgive. The statements were not new to me, but hearing them articulated in this way caused me pain. They informed me that they regretted ever having me and that, had they been aware of my eventual psychotic behavior, they would have terminated the pregnancy. They labeled me a burden on the family and asserted that they were better off when they had just one son. Consequently, they intended to ensure my permanent departure from the family. I was placed on house arrest for a period of 1 week. During this time, I was confined to my room and denied any opportunity to leave. Apart from bathroom breaks and mealtimes, I was confined to my room and denied any opportunity to leave or interact with others. This isolation was profoundly distressing, akin to solitary confinement. However, the situation was compounded by the fact that it was my own parents who were responsible for this treatment. I had not committed a criminal act, I had merely been acting out. I believe that my parents were at least partly culpable, as they had failed to provide the level of attention that I required as a child. As a result, I was unable to form a healthy relationship with them. They should have been more considerate and thought through their decision to have a child. After a week of being treated in this manner, I finally understood what they had meant when they said that I would never be allowed back. One day, without warning, my parents instructed me to gather my belongings and enter the vehicle. My brother and mother assisted me in packing while I waited in the car. Approximately an hour later, I was fully prepared, and we set off on the familiar route. It did not take long for me to realize that we were headed to my grandmother's residence. We proceeded to my grandmother's residence, where my father's mother resided. I surmised that perhaps they were contemplating allowing me to reside there for a period of several weeks to allow me time to regain my composure, given that I was aware that my grandmother was a strict disciplinarian. However, I was also cognizant of her benevolence and the fact that she treated me with greater leniency than my parents did. I did not anticipate that this would be a punitive measure. However, upon my arrival, it became evident that this was not a transient arrangement. My parents were effectively relinquishing their parental responsibilities to my grandmother, indicating a lack of interest in my continued presence. They had taken approximately 1 week to persuade my grandmother to assume the role of my primary caregiver. Upon reaching my grandmother's residence, my parents proceeded to retrieve my belongings from their vehicle and left them at the entrance. They then instructed me to transport these items into the house. They informed me that this would henceforth be my new residence and stated their intention to sever all communication with me. Once more, particularly given my actions, I had been attempting to damage their reputation. However, I had now crossed a line, and I could not undo it. As we reached the door, I attempted to persuade them not to proceed with this decision, emphasizing my desire to maintain a relationship with them. At the age of 14, I was eager to find a sense of belonging within my family. However, the circumstances of being sent to live with my grandmother, who I was unsure would be able to care for me adequately, made the transition challenging. Given her advanced age, she was in her 60s, it was understandable that it had taken her a week to accept me. I was aware that my grandmother loved me, but I was uncertain as to whether she truly wanted to take me in. I was concerned that I might simply become a burden to her, as I had previously been to my parents. I was concerned that I would disappoint her. In the past, whenever I visited her, she would learn about the things I had been doing at home and at school. She would then express disappointment, but she would also encourage me and tell me that she believed I was capable of overcoming these challenges. My parents would be more amenable if I demonstrated improved behavior and had greater self-confidence. This was another reason why I was reluctant to move in with my grandmother, as I believed she would begin to resent me, just as my parents had. I was not willing to risk losing her as well. The situation was rather complex, so I attempted to persuade them. I attempted to persuade them to allow me to remain in their residence. However, they informed me that they had already made a decision and were not open to further discussion. They informed my grandmother that they had terminated our relationship and did not wish to engage with me further. Additionally, they expressed a desire to avoid any potential distress associated with my continued presence in their home. The use of the term freak by my parents was particularly distressing, as it was a term that I had previously endured at the hands of bullies at school. While I had become desensitized to such treatment at the hands of my peers, I was unprepared for the impact of hearing the same words from my own family. I had become inured to such epithets, but when I heard my parents call me a freak, I realized that they were the biggest bullies of my life. In fact, they were doing me a huge favor by letting me live with my grandmother because they never loved me, regardless of my behavior. I suspect that even if I had behaved better, they probably still would not have cared. I had ceased to plead with them because, to them, my brother was the only child they had. Consequently, I accepted the decision that I would henceforth live with my grandmother. I resolved within myself that I would strive to be a better person because I deserved to be treated better and because my grandmother deserved a better grandson. I was not prepared to throw away my life. Once my parents had departed, I was left in the care of my grandmother. We sat down for a conversation that was much needed. She informed me in a transparent manner that, despite her love for me, she had not been prepared to take me in. She also expressed a number of concerns about me, citing her own reservations about my behavior. My grandmother had been informed about my conduct by my father and had stated that, at her age, it would be challenging for her to manage a troubled child like me. She acknowledged that she understood my need for assistance but expressed uncertainty about her ability to provide an appropriate environment for my growth and development. This is why she had been undecided as to whether she should take me in. It took her 1 week to come to a decision. However, after my father informed her that he had grounded me and had kept me locked in my room for the duration of that week, she decided that she would take me in. She concluded that her son was not the optimal individual to raise me. She expressed regret for not intervening sooner, citing her own concerns and limited resources. As a widow with limited personal resources, she was uncertain about the feasibility of adopting me. However, after learning of the extent of my mistreatment, she recognized the necessity of providing a stable and nurturing environment. She was able to comprehend my behavior and expressed a desire for a fresh start. Unlike my biological parents, she sought to do right by me. She encouraged me to view this as an opportunity, which I did. I expressed remorse for my actions and asked for her forgiveness. I informed her of my forgiveness for her failure to intervene and her delayed decision to adopt, despite her awareness of the mistreatment I endured at the hands of my biological parents. We resolved to leave the past behind and collaborate to facilitate a more promising future for me. I remain profoundly grateful to her for her role in my upbringing. I am indebted to my grandmother for her role in my upbringing. Without her influence, I do not believe I would have developed into the individual I am today. Following this pivotal event, I made significant strides in my personal growth, largely due to the guidance and support of my grandmother. After moving in with my grandmother, I made a conscious effort to improve my performance in all areas of my life. She also made significant efforts to support me, provide a conducive environment for my success, and facilitate my academic growth. She secured qualified tutors to assist me with my studies and even enrolled me in private school. In private school, my grandmother ensured that my needs were met, differentiating my treatment from that of other students. Unlike my parents, she did not view this as an excuse but rather as a reason to provide me with the support I required. This approach was beneficial, potentially contributing to my academic success. I was able to graduate with a good score and attend college, as would any other student. I was able to accomplish all of my goals, and I am grateful to my grandmother for that. My parents continued to visit her occasionally, but they never saw me. I was able to avoid their presence whenever they visited. I would leave the house and only return after ascertaining that my parents had indeed departed. Neither my grandmother nor I placed any value on this practice, however, and it continued for a couple of years. Then, my grandmother engaged in a significant dispute with my parents regarding this matter. She asserted that they were inadequate parents for failing to even attempt communication. Despite my improved circumstances and the opportunity for dialogue and reconciliation, my parents remained unresponsive. They denied any shortcomings in their parenting and portrayed themselves as infallible. I was merely a troubled child, a rotten apple, and a freak, according to their assessment. My grandmother, in a fit of rage, forbade them from ever returning. They remained adamant, displaying an egocentricity that precluded them from recognizing their shortcomings as parents and the influence this had on my development. Despite my grandmother's guidance, I had made significant strides by the age of 14. However, it appeared that they were unable to comprehend this, and thus, after that, there was no further communication for almost a decade. My grandmother and I ceased all communication with them and treated them as if they had never existed. I achieved a great deal and reached numerous developmental milestones, yet I never spoke with my parents, and they never reached out to me. Despite the availability of social media, which I utilized, and the fact that I did not block them, they could have reached out to me. They simply chose not to, and only recently have they initiated communication. This is likely due to the recent passing of my grandmother, who was the primary source of support for me. Despite the fact that we had not been cohabiting for approximately 2 years, following my departure from the family home to pursue further education and subsequently take up independent accommodation, she remained a source of unwavering support and guidance. Her absence has resulted in a significant shift in my circumstances, and I am still in the process of adjusting to this change. It was less than 6 months since her passing when I received word from my parents. They demanded that I share my inheritance with them, claiming that my brother, who they had expected to fare better than I did, was not doing as well as they had anticipated. They had come to my aid to clean up the mess that he had made. They had visited me a few days prior, and my brother was not with them, which was surprising because he had always accompanied them on previous visits. I decided to interact with them and engage in conversation because I had assumed that they were there to apologize. However, after a brief exchange, after a brief period of small talk and condolences, they proceeded to discuss the matter at hand. They informed me that, while he was in college, my brother had developed a drug habit, which was now affecting his ability to work. I am uncertain as to why they were attempting to downplay the situation, as it appeared to be quite serious. They also requested that I share my inheritance with them when I would come into money so that they could pay for rehab. I inquired as to why he could not simply attend one of the low-cost programs that they could afford. In response, they informed me that they had attempted to do so, but that it was not sufficient for him. Furthermore, he required a residential program, which, it was explained, would entail significant costs. I must profess a certain ignorance with regard to the financial aspects of rehabilitation, having no personal experience of such a program and no knowledge of the costs involved. However, I am in a position to make a contribution to this matter, given that I now have my own resources, having secured a satisfactory position. My grandmother was also financially secure, having inherited a substantial sum from my grandfather. She had invested these funds wisely, which benefited me, but not my parents, who were too proud to maintain contact with her or even apologize to her in the latter stages of her life. I was aware that they would likely require the funds in any case, so I did not concern myself with the details. I informed my parents that I was prepared to assist them with whatever amount they deemed necessary. However, I stipulated that they must publicly acknowledge their past actions. This included the unfortunate manner in which they had treated me, the statements they had made to me, and the way they had treated my grandmother. Additionally, I required them to acknowledge that they currently needed my assistance and the reason for their request for money. This was to ensure transparency and prevent any misunderstanding. Given that we had maintained confidentiality for years, primarily at my grandmother's request, the recent overture from them, requesting financial assistance despite a history of mistreatment, compelled me to take action. I felt compelled to address the matter publicly to set the record straight. I did not experience any negative emotions when I requested this of them because I wanted them to publicly acknowledge their wrongdoings. When I made this request, their expressions indicated their dismay. They attempted to negotiate with me, claiming that I was being unreasonable and somewhat selfish. However, I informed them that this was my stipulation, and they were free to accept or decline. I was willing to provide them with the necessary funds. I had no objections to my brother, and he had no objections to them. However, for me to fully move on from the incident, they would have to acknowledge their actions. They had treated me poorly, and they had also been unkind to my grandmother. This was the money in question, and if they wanted her money, they had to acknowledge their wrongdoing. It was a straightforward request. I am unsure why they are behaving this way. It is curious to note that upon my informing them of this, they began to label me as heartless and emotionless, asserting that they had not anticipated such a response from me. I countered that they should not have expected anything from me, given that we had not even been in communication for the past 10 years. It would be reasonable to expect that they would acknowledge and accept their mistakes and apologize for them. That would be the extent of my willingness to engage with them on this matter. I am not interested in further discussion. They eventually left, after a period of intense emotional distress and accusations. However, I remained unmoved. Now, they are attempting to persuade me that my brother is in a dire situation and that I should provide assistance. I am perplexed by their expectation that I would do so. I have consistently provided assistance to them without any expectation of reciprocal support. My grandmother and I were our family's sole source of support. They never offered assistance or even inquired about our well-being, even after my grandmother's passing. I was the only one who informed our relatives about the funeral arrangements. Consequently, I am reluctant to extend further help. Even those who have had no contact with us for the past 10 years should be made aware that I will not provide financial assistance if they do not publicly acknowledge and accept responsibility for their actions. I would like to thank everyone who commented on my original post. I am coping well with the loss of my grandmother, who was of advanced age, has passed away. I am grateful that she is no longer suffering and that she lived her life to the fullest. I am certain that she did not pass away with any regrets. Therefore, I thank you for your concern and condolences. Regarding my parents, they are still attempting to contact me online. However, I have informed them that if they do not comply with my instructions, they will no longer have any claim to any inheritance. My grandmother bequeathed all her assets to me in her last will and testament. I am confident that my parents are aware of this fact, as the lawyer who drafted the document sent an email to all relevant parties. Consequently, they are now in a position where they can only wait and see what will happen. I am not going to renege on my word. It has been 1 week since I last spoke to them. Since none of their police officers has been working with me, they have resorted to sending me photos of my brother. Furthermore, he appears to be in a rather unfortunate state. They persist in sending me images of him, emphasizing that he is the individual who requires assistance and that I should take the initiative to provide it. I have but one response to this: where were they when I needed that kind of help? They effectively abandoned me. I was fortunate that my grandmother was there to support me, but otherwise I am uncertain as to what my fate would have been. Ultimately, they demonstrated a lack of concern for my well-being. While I empathize with my brother's situation, I am unable to assist them unless they express remorse for their actions. This must be done publicly to expose their true character. If they can set aside their egos for this single act, I may reconsider my stance. However, my primary objective is to challenge their pride. It was their pride that the actions of these individuals have led to the situation in which they are now compelled to prioritize the well-being of the child they claim to love over their own pride. It is my hope that they will choose the former over the latter. It has been 10 days since I last spoke with my parents. After a period of inactivity, I ceased responding to their messages. However, they have recently reappeared, visiting my residence a few hours ago. They subsequently visited me once more, accompanied by my brother. The encounter at the door was particularly contentious. I informed them that their actions were unacceptable and that their behavior was only serving to impede any potential resolution. I made it clear that I was not comfortable with their approach, even when it came to my brother. I could not help but imagine how dehumanizing it was to be used as a mere instrument. I demanded that they leave, but they initially refused. They then demanded that I promise to assist them as soon as possible. I refused to make such a promise, stating that if they attempted to engage in any further misconduct, I would contact the police. This threat, coupled with the fact that my brother was in a vulnerable state, caused them to retreat. They departed, but my father informed me that both my grandmother and he considered themselves to be the epitome of selfish individuals. This assertion is particularly noteworthy given that they had previously abandoned me with her, solely due to their inability to cope with a child with special needs. In truth, they had no desire to interact with me because I did not conform to their expectations of a perfect child. If my grandmother and I are indeed selfish, then the most appropriate description for them would be. It is worth noting that the concept of selfish did not even exist at the time. Update 3. In addition, I have informed all my relatives that they are not to divulge my address to anyone, particularly my parents. The previous occasion on which somebody had disclosed my address to my parents was when their son was suffering and in need of assistance. This resulted in my parents contacting me directly, which I did not wish to occur again. In any case, following the last conversation in which my father accused me of being selfish, I decided to terminate contact with them. I was no longer willing to engage in futile discussions. It became evident that my relatives placed their pride above all else, even above their professed love for me. I had long accepted that they did not love me and never wanted me. Despite my dyslexia and ADHD, and the plethora of problems that I had, my brother was somebody who they had always claimed they loved and was perfect to them. Therefore, it was perplexing that they were unable or unwilling to make one little sacrifice for him. All they had to do was acknowledge that they had made a mistake. It would have been relatively simple to do so, as even though we had tried our best to maintain a relationship, the majority of our family was already aware of the animosity between us, so it was not as if they were going to acknowledge something that nobody had known. They were reluctant to apologize for their mistakes because, in their minds, they had never done anything wrong and they were, in their estimation, perfect. They are at liberty to hold their beliefs, and I am similarly at liberty to retain my inheritance.